Welcome back to the Hawaiian Shirt Coder and the Web API series. In this video we're going to have a look at the HTTP Get Verb and get some player data. So welcome back. In the last video we set up the basic solution in Visual Studio. It had two projects. It had the actual API project and it had a shared library where we added our models and our data access folders and whatnot. Not much in them at this stage. So the MVC model, like we said in the previous video, has models, which is the data that we're interested in the API. So that's being stored in our shared project, and controllers, which sort of map URL addresses to methods in our underlying controllers. And like we said before, with APIs there isn't really any view. The view will get handled by the consumer of the web API in whatever way they want to deal with it. The only view really is the payload that comes back, which may be in JSON or XML. So that's where we left it last time, and we also just showed a very quick API call that doesn't do anything other than return a hard-coded string. So here we are in the Swagger documentation. And API player, if we try it out, go execute, we hit the breakpoint in the code and we come back with our hard-coded message data from server. So that's as far as we got. What we're going to do in this video is actually do two gets that actually return player data. The first get will return all player data that we've got in the system. At the moment the system or database doesn't exist, so what we're going to do to overcome that is we're going to just have an in-memory list of players that will act as our database, and then our second API call will return one of those players from our in-memory list based on the player's ID. This approach is quick and dirty, as we're doing all the coding in our player controller method. At a later date we will refactor all of this out. Just spotted a spelling mistake. Refactor all of this out into a separation of concerns, and that's where our SMS shared library will come into play. And by doing that, the code will become more testable and more extendable and more readable. So with that in place, we'll get started. It is worth noting this project is exactly the same as when we left it in the previous video. The only thing I've changed is in the models folder, both the fixture and players classes, I've added an additional field, and that is the ID field. So the ID field is thinking ahead to when we do actually have a database. Records in a database have a unique identifier. That's normally an ID of some sort, and that's what this field represents, both in the fixture and the player objects. So what we're going to do now is go back to the players controller. We're going to get rid of this dummy method and replace it with our first piece of work, which is to return every player in our system. Now, like I stated earlier on, we haven't got a database at the moment, so we have to simulate our database, and we're going to do that by having an in-memory list of players. So what I'm going to do is because this isn't particularly exciting code, I'm just going to copy and paste the code in and walk you through it. So within the player controller, I'm going to create a private field that is called _players, and that is a list of players, and player is from our models. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create the constructor for this controller, and you can do that using the snippet of CTOR tab. And then what I'm going to do is basically add some players into this list, and that will act as our database and will be good enough for us to return some data. So again, not particularly exciting code, so I'm just going to copy that and paste it in and walk you through it. Formatting's gone a bit out of line, but we'll worry about that in a minute. So yeah, so what I've done is I've added 3 players, basically John Smith, Peter Parker and Ben Stokes, to the list of players, and that's what we will access for our database for the time being. Just see if I can realign this. There we go, so that's a little bit better. So that's that. So that's all our sort of setup work. Now we can actually get down to writing the code for the return all players endpoint. So we'll use this existing endpoint that we had before, and we'll just put a new implementation in there. And the implementation for this is very simple. In this case, is all we will do is we will return an OK, which is we'll return 200, and along with the HTTP 200 success, we will return the list of players, and that is it. So we'll put a breakpoint on here, and we'll just run this up just to see what it does. And this time we should have some more meaningful data for our player endpoint. So we try it out, go execute, we hit our endpoint, here's our list of players, there's 3 players in there. If we hit F5, this is what gets returned back to the Swagger client: John Smith, Peter Parker, Ben Stokes, with the 200 code. And the URL that generated that code is this one here. So like I said before, there's no magic, this just gives us a nice UI to see the data. We could just stick this in another browser tab, hit that, and we still hit the same endpoint, and we still get the same data back. It's just in not a very pretty format. So that's getting every player in the system back. This would be very similar if you were implementing the fixtures list as well, return all the fixtures in the system, which I will do behind the scenes, but I don't see it adds any value doing it while we're recording because it's exactly the same as the player one. So our next thing to do is to stop this, go back to our readme, and so this one is now done. What we're going to do now is we're going to return another get endpoint, but this time we're going to provide it with a parameter that will filter that list down, so we only get 1 player back, or maybe no players back if it can't find a match. So we go back to the code, and what we do with this is we create another HTTP Get, and we give it a name, public action result, and we'll call this one get player by ID, and this requires a parameter which is the ID. So by ID we mean this bit here, we could write an endpoint that says get me back all the Peter or the players called Peter, so search by first name, but ID is a more unique way of doing it. What we also need to do, which is a little bit different from last time, is we have to add an additional route to this. Because at the moment that is exactly the same route as the one above, so the system wouldn't know which one to go to. So it has to be almost like a unique signature. And this signature is basically saying I'm going to pass you the URL, but I'm also going to pass you on the end of the URL the ID that I'm interested in. And this in curly brackets needs to match the input parameter, which you'll see in a moment how that works. So what we need to do here is we need to say var player equals, then we go and query the players list, players.first or default x equals x.id equals the input parameter supplied. So what this will do is it will go away and it will query the list of players and try and find a match based on the ID that you supplied. So if one comes into the endpoint, it will go have a look through the list and say, have I got any with an ID of 1, which would return back John Smith. But if we passed in an ID of 99, we haven't got an ID of 99 in the system, what happens then? Well, that's where this first or default comes in. So if it can find something, it will return you back something of that type, which is a player, but if it can't find it, in this case it will return back its default, and the default for an object is null, so it will return that back. So this requires a little bit more code. So first of all, what we need to do is a check. So based on running that query, we need to check, does it return anything back? If it returns back null, what we want to do is return a different HTTP code back to the caller, and rather than an OK, which is a 200, we want to return back a not found, which if we look at the IntelliSense is a 404. 404 not found. Well, you see these on web pages when you hit an address that no longer exists, you get a 404 page not found. So we're using this to say 404 no data found. However, if we do have something in the player variable, it's not null, we will return OK player. So let's walk through this one to see how this one works, and you'll see what I mean by changing the route so it's different to the one above. So when we fire up Swagger this time, we should have 2 endpoints. We do, and you can see that the endpoints are virtually the same. API player, which is a get, API player, which is a get, but this time it's expecting an ID on the end for this one. So if we try this one out, first thing you'll notice is we get an input box where it's expecting us to provide an integer ID. Now if you try this out and try and submit it, it's a required input parameter, so it won't even hit the endpoint. But if we say, let's try 3, which we know is Ben Stokes, and if we hit execute, that hits our endpoint. The ID's got passed through, so that URL route has got routed to this method, get player by ID, knows it's a get, it matches the signature, it's got the ID, it goes and runs the query, passing in that ID, we hit F10, have a look at the player object, it has returned 1 player, Ben Stokes, which is good. So the player returned isn't null, so it will jump over that and return a 200, which is success, and will also include the player object in the payload as JSON. So if we hit F5, scroll down, you can see you get a 200 code, and we get Ben Stokes returned in the list. This is the URL that's got supplied that does that. Like I said before, no magic. If we just copy this out, open in a new tab, paste that in, still hits the same breakpoint. If we hit F5, still get the data back. It's just not in the pretty swagger UI. So that's good. So the other thing to test with this is if we supply an ID that doesn't exist or doesn't return any data in the system. So if we say 999, we know we haven't got an ID for that in the system. We run this. Again, we hit the same mapping and action result. We're passing in 999. We go off and query the database or the in-memory list for anything that has 999. If it finds anything, it will return a object of type player. If it doesn't, it will return the default for an object which is null. In this case, it's returned null, so this condition will now get hit, and we jump into the return not found. And this time we get a different status code. We get a 404 not found, and we get a message basically saying the same thing, not found. Again, no magic. Here's the magic URL that does all the work. If we go back to here, paste that in there, run it, you still get the 404 error back, which the calling code that consumes your API can check for that status and go off and perform a different sort of action, display an error message on the screen or redirect somewhere else or whatever your application needs to do. So that's basically the two endpoints I want to show in this video. They are both getting data from the system. What we will do next is a couple of things, not sure which order I'll do them in, but we will look at other endpoints that use other verbs: post, put, patch, delete, so we can actually add data into our system. We will also look at a better way of doing this rather than placing all this logic in the controller. So that is separation of concerns, because at the moment this controller needs to know what the database is, even though it's an in-memory database, and it needs to know how to query it, which isn't the controller's responsibility. The controller's responsibility is to map a URL that someone's entered to an action and then delegate the responsibility of what that action is meant to do to something else, the domain logic. And at a later date this will get refactored out and placed into our shared library, and that will introduce lots of good things that will enable us to test, and also dependency injection, so we can swap out our various layers for different ones as we see fit. So I'm the Hawaiian shirt coder. That's the end of this session. Please remember to like, subscribe, share with your friends. Remember, keep learning, keep exploring, keep developing, and I'll see you next time.